All right, Vlada, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I understand that there are 10 official people taking this course. Is that right? I would like to see who you are. Just see if you're clustered over here. Oh, you're hiding your hand. Okay, a couple back there. All right, great. So it's actually a real pleasure to be able to give you my understanding, my sort of humble understanding of the biosphere, because it's a vast, complicated thing with thousands and millions of questions one could ask. I've published papers on specific aspects of some of the parts of what I'm going to talk to you tonight about. For example, a lot on the global carbon cycle and life in distributing nutrients in the ocean. I got interested in evolutionary events, like as gymnosperms evolved to angiosperms, how did that perhaps change atmospheric CO2 with changing the weathering rate? The evolution of calcareous plankton that changed the deposition of calcium in the ocean. While doing biotic enhancement of weathering, which you'll hear about tonight, but in doing these, I was always also interested in the bigger question: how does the biosphere really work? We can ask these specific questions, and they're very important for publishing the scientific papers. But I also wanted to know: are there certain principles that exist on the biosphere scale that are different, for example, from the smaller scales within it, different from an ecosystem? Is the biosphere a giant ecosystem? Is it like a cell? Is it is it something unique unto itself? What kinds of questions should we be asking about the biosphere as a system? So thanks to this course, to some people having signed up for the course, they run the course, and how could they not sign up for this wonderful course? So Vlada, and thank you, gives me an opportunity to speak about these big issues of the biosphere. So here we go. Vlada mentioned this book, Gaia's Body, Toward a Physiology of the Earth. How many have heard of something called the Gaia hypothesis, or this word? Oh, many people. So I'll say a few words about that at the end. And I do see the Earth as a kind of physiology, a kind of metabolism. And that's a bit what I'm after tonight, how to understand this metabolism. A more recent book, which does not really have to do with the biosphere, but it's in there, is CO2 Rising. This was a book I wrote to try to explain the the global carbon cycle to the general public. MIT Press, I might say. In fact, the paperback of Gaia's Body was MIT Press too. So I have a fondness in my heart for MIT Press. Because I found that it's after some understanding of climate that people would have, they wouldn't really understand enough depth about the carbon cycle to get what's going on. So I'll mention a little bit about some of the aspects, because I do think that the general public's understanding and the understanding that CO2 is a global phenomenon that all nations are contributing to, or some nations contribute to more than others, like the United States, but everyone's going to be affected by climate, is starting to give this global biosphere perspective to everybody. And Vlada and I were talking earlier about how really vital that perspective is going to be for the future of the planet. So a quick outline of some of the topics I'm going to be talking about to greater or less extent tonight. First of all, the biosphere as a system. I say it's reflections of the biosphere as a system. What system are we talking about? What are its parts? A little bit on fluxes across the borders of the biosphere, the upper and lower border of the biosphere. A concept I call the biochemical guilds, and a complementary concept called complementary metabolisms. Then a little bit on evolution and the braid of PVS, propagation, variation, and selection. I'm now calling this a braid because a braid has three parts to it, so these are sub-processes. And one can talk about biological evolution, and I submit cultural evolution as well, in not just metaphorically, but really because they share some common dynamics. Cycling ratios, it's been an important concept of mine for a while. Terrestrial mostly, but I'll touch on marine. Evolutionary innovations and the climate and chemistry of the biosphere. Hopefully some of this will build upon earlier parts of the talk, we'll see. And then byproducts versus large-scale adaptations. biotic enhancement of weathering, and then if I get to it, and if not, it's okay, major transitions of evolution, including the transition to culture. Okay, so here we go with some of these topics. Again, my main goal is that you come away with some general concepts that I hope we share, but you can feel free to ask clarifying questions at any point or larger questions at any point as I move along. Okay. So first, the biosphere as a system. People define the biosphere in different ways. I'm going to look at it in a specific way that I'm going to make an argument for. It's about 1/400th of the Earth's radius, and this is because it is the system that includes the atmosphere, the ocean, soil, and all organisms. So I see it as a four-part system. Some people call the biosphere, they use it synonymous with what I would call biota, global biota. Some people use the word biosphere to mean there's the biosphere, there's the atmosphere, there's the hydrosphere. I would call that the biota. The way I use the word biosphere would be the way most environmental scientists would use it, though some will talk about the biosphere, just so you're aware, some will talk about it as the farthest most extent of life in altitude. So where is life in the highest, in the clouds or at the highest mountain, and where's life lowest in the ocean, and that's really in the sediment, so it's almost synonymous with the ocean. But that's somewhat different. That's an abstract term. That's sort of defining it as a zone of life, where I want to define it more in the way a systems person would define it. What's the real system here? And once we define the system, which I'll show you in a second, how does the biosphere work? How does this system work? Once you have the parts, how does it work? So here are three of the parts: the atmosphere at the top, the ocean down here, and the soil. And these circulate at different time scales. So, for example, we know the atmosphere is about a year through climate studies. It's the CO2, for example, the South Pole is lagging about a year behind the Northern Hemisphere, where most of the CO2 is going into the Northern Hemisphere. The atmosphere is a well-mixed box in the time scale of about a year. The ocean, through studies of radioactive tracers, carbon-14 and some other tracers, we know the oceans are Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian are one interconnected body of liquid water that completely mixes in about 1,000 years. It's mostly the surface to get down to the longest time period is the deep part of the Pacific Ocean, about 1,000 years. You could think of the ocean as a well-mixed bathtub in about 1,000 years. Not that it's homogeneous temperature-wise, because there's temperature inputs at the surface, but what it means that changes that happen chemically in any one part of the ocean get propagated elsewhere in the oceans about 1,000 years. Soil is a complicated layered system. It can, some of the detritus can go around in days if an earthworm eats a leaf that's dropped down there. But typically we'll think of the soil as years to decades to maybe hundreds of years. There are soils, some of the tundra can be thousands of years before it turns over. Now, what do I mean by circulation? The soil, organisms can circulate the soil by biological movement, bioturbation they sometimes call it, the turbation due to biology. Roots penetrate the soil, cause chemical changes. Soil gets formed and it weathers. And so that's why it's not an easy, it's not a fluid substance, but one can talk about a time scale of the soil as well. Now these connect. Gases from the atmosphere penetrate the soil, and gases generated in the soil, let's say the CO2 from the respiration of the organism in the soil, the very high PCO2 in the soil goes up into the atmosphere. So the soil is a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. Gas exchange back and forth, and of course there's rain coming down, carrying ions. So there's circulation there. Atmosphere to ocean. There's also gas exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean. Gases are moving back and forth. Those gas exchange rates are characterized. They can depend on temperature. They can depend on wind speed. The winds can also carry particles, iron particles and other minerals to the ocean as well. And there can be substances leaving the ocean, organic gases that go out of the ocean or particles that go up into the atmosphere. Finally, soil to ocean. The main exchange here I'm thinking of is are the rivers that carry, the streams and rivers that carry sediments, loads, and dissolved ions to the ocean. So these three pools or reservoirs are well mixed as a system over about 1,000 years. The longest, in other words, the longest reservoir, the one with the slowest time scale determines the system. And so that means changes in the atmosphere also propagate into the ocean. This is happening today with our CO2 going into the atmosphere. It's not just staying there. Some of it's going as a gas into the ocean, becoming carbonic acid in the ocean. And this is the ocean acidification that's being talked about. So there's a direct example of this interconnected system right now. Now, I'm going to be getting into life because life is the fourth component of this biosphere system, and life is in the ocean, life is in the soil, obviously, and life is in the atmosphere in the form of, well, we live in the atmosphere. We are participating as exchange agents with the atmosphere. Trees live in the atmosphere. They take in CO2 through their leaves. So creatures are affecting these, I call them sometimes environmental matrices or biosphere matrices of what would ordinarily be the inorganic realm, but now you have life living in these with very high surface areas. The surface areas of plankton in the ocean are several times the Earth's surface area itself. The leaf area index of trees can be many times the area of the ground. The exchange surfaces. So I sometimes think of life as exchange surfaces, and with these biosphere environmental matrices. So that's the four components, and they're really hooked up with each other. And I do not include the rock here, even though rock is very important when it comes up and becomes mountains, and then it weathers and supplies ions. For the following reason: a rock can get uplifted, as they say there's a cliff. The minerals or the atoms in that cliff, they may have had the same neighbors for millions or hundreds of millions of years. In down deep, now it's uplifted, now it's in a mountain, but it's not an active exchange with these components. Once a piece of rock gets to the surface and the mineral maybe weathers off and the calcium comes off and now goes into a river and goes into the ocean and can start getting circulated around, it can be, and now it's active. Now it can be in a life form, it can be in an ocean water, it can get blown up onto the land. Now it gets circulated around. So when a carbon atom, for example, comes up through a volcano as CO2 into the atmosphere, it may have been in a calcium carbonate rock for, again, hundreds of millions of years, locked in calcium carbonate in that rock, not participating in the biosphere. Now it's in the biosphere. It can go into plants, it can go into the ocean and become inorganic ions in the ocean. It can become part of the soil. It can be a tree that's going to be 1,000-year-old redwood tree and then get respired off. Typically, a carbon atom, once it gets into the biosphere, coming from deep Earth, is in circulation for about 100,000 years, going in and out of these different forms within the biosphere. So this is my argument that the biosphere is really constitutes a system. Yes?
Would it be useful to talk about the mixing times in relationship between the air, the water, and the soil?
It is useful. So for example, the mixing time of CO2 in the air is about 4 years. But now we have to talk about particular chemical constituents because the mixing time of atmosphere but the throughput of oxygen back and forth to the ocean is much, much longer because of the concentration. The mass of O2 is so high in the atmosphere. But yes, it is, when one sets up models of these, one wants to know that the mixing times of all of them. Okay. So just a little picture of the fluxes of these components: atmosphere at the top, Here I have plants, a form of life, soil, and ocean. And these arrows represent the magnitudes of the carbon fluxes in the width of the arrows. This is in billions of tons of carbon per year. It shows that the fossil fuel flux is relatively small. Some people might say, you know, gee, the bacteria of the soil release many times more CO2 into the atmosphere than humans are. What's the problem? Well, these, we have good evidence that these have been pretty closely in balance. This is from the ice core CO2 record, that the CO2 hasn't changed much for many thousands of years. But we're taking basically geological carbon and putting it up. And our flux is about 20 times more the natural volcanic flux, which I'll talk about a little more. But just gives you a visual imagery of the interconnectivity. And to emphasize these time scales here of the 1,000 years, these are very short compared to evolutionary time scales of the origination of species or the extinction of species. So you can think of the biosphere, I think of the biosphere as this chemically interconnected system in which the organisms that put out a gas, let's say into the atmosphere, that gas is going to affect creatures at the bottom of the ocean in a virtually an instantaneous time scale with respect to evolution. So that's the biosphere. And one more example, with each exhalation I put out, and I assume you put out too, about 5 times 10 to the 20th molecules of CO2. I did a little calculation of where the CO2 goes. I was interested in finding the CO2 as carbon in a leaf somewhere, but it can become, now it's CO2 in the atmosphere, it can go into become bicarbonate ion in the ocean, it can become part of a cellulose molecule inside a plant. And when I did the calculation, within about a year, you can go out and take a plant, a leaf of a plant, and find a few dozen atoms of carbon that were in the CO2 molecules that you exhaled. And that is every leaf you pick anywhere on the planet. In the Amazon, in Japan, anywhere on the planet has carbon atoms from every single one of your exhalations. It's staggering, but I did have the math checked by some people too. That so that's true for everybody. You know, your breath too is on every leaf of the planet. So if you're ever feeling a little down, you are bigger. Okay. So parts of the biosphere. So I've already showed you those parts, and now what I didn't show you was life, and we're eventually going to get into something I'm calling biochemical guilds. Every cell is important. Every human being is important, but the biochemical guilds are a way of thinking of the components of life, and I'll get into those. And so, for example, you have creatures that form calcium carbonate can form a guild. If it's a system, you know, MIT, there's lots of discussion of, you know, boundaries here. You know, you've drawn your system. What are the fluxes across your system boundary? If you're doing thermodynamics or fluid mechanics, fluxes across the border. So this biosphere is a spherical shell. And so it has an upper boundary, upper border to space, and lower border to the lower border is a little bit indistinct. It doesn't go, you know, from a 1,000-year time scale immediately to hundreds of millions of years. There are slower time scales, but basically slower time scales down into rock. So there's an upper border and a lower border. We'll talk about the material fluxes. Very little coming from space, except occasionally a big killer asteroid comes. You know, so occasionally the material flux from space is really important. But material fluxes from below are very important. I'll talk about those. Thought you might be interested in some of the energy fluxes. 120,000 terawatts of solar absorbed. That's on a continuous basis, of course, is power. The lower border, geothermal, is about 30 terawatts coming up from Earth, from the deep Earth. It sounds insignificant, but it does give us plate tectonics and gives us mountains, and otherwise the Earth would be flat. So over long time scales, this small energy flux is important. Fluxes inside the biosphere. about 4,000 terawatts go from solar because of the Earth as a sphere, and you get hot and cold regions that drive the circulation of atmosphere and ocean. This circulation of atmosphere and ocean, if you're thinking of the planet as kind of like a interconnected system of life, as a global metabolism, this in a way is the blood system, but it's for free. This is the circulatory system of the global metabolism. About 150 terawatts is continually going into global photosynthesis, being chemically bound into the compounds of life, the organic carbon compounds. You might want to be interested to compare that to currently human energy consumption is about 17 terawatts. So it's approaching the geothermal. It's nowhere near the solar absorbed, and this is why some people say, the big possibility is solar, of course, because of the comparison of these two. Global photosynthesis is about 0.1% efficient. Terrestrial is more efficient than the ocean. Terrestrial is about 0.3% efficient. Calculations I've done and others have done with the sort of the maximum quantum yield and maximum sort of optimizing the system, it looks like photosynthesis could be about 3%. So photosynthesis is about 1/10 of its optimum, which some of the farms try to approach on for part of the year, of course, only the growing season. So that's a little bit of consideration of the upper and lower boundaries. Now, something I call biochemical guilds and complementary metabolisms. How to understand life without going down to every cell. This comes about from trying to model the system. If you're trying to model carbon and nitrogen in the ocean, or carbon in the ocean, or something on land, carbon again on land, you are faced with lumping organisms together into large-scale subsystems or processes that behave inside which they behave relatively uniformly, that you feel you can parameterize them as something. And thinking about this, I was thinking about the parts of the biosphere. I just came up with the term. I didn't come up with the concept. The people doing the modeling come up with the same idea, but the term I decided was worthy of a word. So the concept was worthy of a word. The term was worthy of a word, yeah. So biochemical guilds. Now biochemical guilds would be lumping together all species that perform the same chemical transformation. Because one thing all organisms do is that they take in nutrients and they expel waste. So they all create chemical transformations. If they're photosynthesizers, they've got to take in nutrients to build various parts of their molecules. If they're respirers, like we are, they've got to take in materials to build their body and to be energy. So there's differences in the use of energy here, but they're all doing material transformations. And there's methanogens that produce methane. There's photosynthesizers that take in CO2. I'm not showing all the transformations here, but for nitrogen, there's nitrogen fixers, there's denitrifiers, there's nitrifiers. You can do the same for sulfur. You can look at phosphorus. Now, one thing that's really important to how the biosphere works is the fact that many of these guilds. So the carbon is not the guild. The guild are these. Any organism that does photosynthesis could be could be a cyanobacterium, could be an oak tree, could be a kelp, could be lumped together as a photosynthesizer, and the waste product from respirers, which we are and many bacteria are, produce the same waste product, the same CO2 that goes into the photosynthesizers. I'm not going to draw all of them here, but there's waste nutrient couplings with nitrogen. There are waste nutrient couplings with sulfur. So I think this is something very important to how the biosphere works. This had to come about through some evolutionary process. We can talk about that a bit later. So these biochemical guilds are linked to each other and the environmental matrices by the fact that waste from one guild are nutrients to another. So there have been established what could be called think it was David Schwartzman that called it this, but others may have used the term complementary metabolisms. Individual creatures that are trying to survive on their own and doing their own evolutionary gig are connected through this waste nutrient complementary metabolism. Yes?
Are the intake and outtake fluxes balanced?
Not necessarily, but they can be possibly very closely balanced because the wastes can end up to be a source of a chemical to the environment, and if something can use that waste, it probably will. So you'll see with CO2 they are very closely balanced, but they don't have to be. Okay. This probably has to do with what some might call the self-organizing properties of the biosphere, if you're into that term. Okay. Now, to have this come about, one has to invoke evolution, obviously, in some kind of way. Nothing in life makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I like to think of evolution as a three-part process, a braid, propagation, variation, and selection. It's in Darwin's last famous paragraph. And I'm not going to go a lot into it, but just that we can talk about processes of propagation. Organisms reproduce themselves, there's genetic variation, and there's selection. Some people call this a logical skeleton, that you can also have this in culture as well. But I want to point out the fact that once you have organisms, creatures that replicate themselves, and the genetics are complicated enough that there are mutations, because of what life does, of importing nutrients and exporting waste, one automatically gets some selection for the following reason, that the importing of nutrients is depleting the environment of those nutrients and presumably setting up competition among creatures of the same guild that use the same nutrients. And the ejection of waste is putting something that to those guilds can be toxic because they're putting it out as waste. It might be perfectly good food to some other guild, but it's toxic to that particular guild. So that's setting up dynamics of individual entities that are, in a sense, competing with each other to do their propagation term, and we get evolution as a result. How that relates to the biochemical guilds, we can talk about. Now, to try to think about dynamics of the biosphere, I'm going to introduce a concept called cycling ratios, terrestrial and marine. And this cycling ratio is defined in the following way. You take a system, you draw a boundary around something that you want to investigate. And it could be a lake, it could be a forest, it could be all of the continents, which I'm going to show you some numbers for. It could be all of the biosphere. I think this could be applied to different scales. And one's going to look at the photosynthetic uptake of a certain element. The photosynthetic uptake of carbon or nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. There's about 12 to 15, 16 essential nutrients. Magnesium, calcium, iron, copper. And one was looking at the inputs and outputs. Now for this case, I'm going to assume inputs and outputs are the same. There's reasons to think that they will get balanced out after a while. And I'm going to define a cycling ratio as this uptake over the export over the uptake over the input. If they're the same, I'm not concerned about, they don't have to be the same, but I'm not concerned about those cases at the moment. I just wanted to get a metric for some kind of dynamics that could be applied at different scales so I could start saying something and seeing something about terrestrial, marine, the global. The reason I'm doing photosynthetic uptake is because this is where it enters the food webs through photosynthesis. Then it can go to other organisms. And if the photosynthetic uptake is larger than the input, that means there has to be recycling mechanisms inside this system. And the cycling ratio gives you a metric of how effective the recycling mechanisms are. If the cycling ratio were just 1, that means its input, perhaps its photosynthesis takes it up, it dies, and it leaves the system. Yes?
Can you give an examples of what you mean by input and export?
Yes, so input in the case of carbon to the biosphere the input is volcanoes releasing CO2, bringing up gases, and it's also the dissolution of rock that contains carbon. Nitrogen brought up also in gases, and it can be typically to the biosphere it's either gases or it's solid materials that are being eroded. Now once you get into land, I'll show you pictures. The input can be rock getting input into the soil some kind of way. So here's the story with carbon globally. Global carbon, we know the global photosynthesis, terrestrial and marine, is about 100 billion tons a year. The border here is the biosphere itself, and we know the input pretty well, and it's pretty well balanced by the burial, but these are long time scales, so they do this by looking at the river input. They do this by doing some estimates of the weathering rate. It's about 500 million tons per year. So what this means is that photosynthesis, I only show a tree here, but includes the algae. Photosynthesis is incorporating carbon, taking carbon out of the inorganic form into the organic form at about 200 times the rate that the carbon is being supplied. And so this is a cycling ratio of about 200 for the biosphere as a whole, which means it's really effective. The organic stuff is recycled into the respirators very effectively. One way to think about this is that you could have plants on a planet that did not have respirators recycling the CO2. The vegetation would not die necessarily. Of course, it would be a very strange planet. I'm not sure how well it would work with all the nutrients. But the photosynthesis would be reduced to about 1/200th of what it currently is, were plants and algae in the ocean having to rely on the carbon that's coming new, fresh from volcanoes and rock weathering. Therefore, these complementary metabolisms are not just a kind of interesting fact that we have to look at from evolution. They actually enhance total global productivity by having the hookups of the nutrients and wastes of these complementary biochemical guilds. So you can say all life is maybe 200 times more with respect to carbon than it would be without these complementary metabolisms. Now, how does this happen? It happens because within the system there are all kinds of complicated biological and non-biological transformations that have to do with the photosynthesized material getting passed into the food webs and getting passed into temporary forms, like say in the soil, and getting taken up by another organism. But this just shows that there can be very large fluxes within a boundary and very small fluxes across. Okay, and of course the magic with the carbon cycle is the respirators. The nitrogen cycle. This is a diagram of the nitrogen cycle. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just to show you, here's the boundary of the biosphere. There are some inorganic processes in here, like the lightning taking N2 from the atmosphere and taking it into a form which is an ion form that can be available to vegetation. But most of these pathways in here are various kinds of guilds that have been evolved in the nitrogen cycle, in which some waste that some guild was making got put into a nutrient of another one. And the number here depends on, there's some uncertainty. I say it's between 500 and 1300, so it's roughly 1,000 times. That means an atom of nitrogen that comes up through volcanism and weathering will go into photosynthesis about 1,000 times before it gets put into a form in which it gets buried. So really high cycling ratio. I taught a course in Accra, Ghana a couple years ago in January, and they took us, part of this course they had to deal with the future of the planet. Went to a place where they're ripping apart things that they get from Europe or other places and trying to resell them. And it was very kind of elementary recycling, people doing things by hand, very upsetting actually about the kind of, we got to get the planet prosperous. It's one of my other concerns, how are we going to have global prosperity? But I do think that we can take the message from nature, that this puts some numbers on the increased prosperity of nature from the recycling capacities that have happened in the biosphere. So I think some that's going on with industrial ecology, for example, or what they're now calling the circular economy. A lesson from nature can be that we can have increased material fluxes for everybody if we're now part of those material fluxes with the recycling, rather than just the drawing up from deep. I want to show you a couple things about phosphorus. This is a phosphorus on the land. The cycling ratio is 46. So this is not the global number for phosphorus. This is just on the land, calculating the phosphorus uptake by land vegetation versus what's coming from rock. That differs a lot from calcium when the cycling ratio is about 1. So these cycling ratios are very element dependent. They depend on the needs, the proportional needs by the organisms, and they depend, which has to do with the stoichiometry of the bodies of creatures, and they depend upon the availability. Calcium is very available. And when you do these numbers, it turns out that the high cycling ratios of phosphorus, nitrogen, tend to be elements which are used in fertilizer. They do tend to be elements that are lacking often in the soil. They could be the elements to be thought of as kind of on the cutting edge, perhaps, of evolution. That if evolution were to get these guilds operating better to recycle, let's say, the phosphorus or the nitrogen, there seems to be enough calcium coming around. Sometimes you do need to put calcium on certain fields, but globally these numbers somewhat correspond to the classical, the high cycling ratios correspond to the classical needs. So you can, these might be, the cutting edges, and one can start looking at the proportions of the elements in in various tissues, which I'm not going to do here. In the ocean, the marine cycling ratio for phosphorus is about 6 times higher than the terrestrial cycling ratio. You can ask why that is. I think that is because the whole ocean is basically a zone of potential recycling. It's so because as the detritus falls down through kilometers of ocean, there's a lot of opportunity to be recycled. Where on land, once it gets down deep in the soil, there can be a lack of oxygen. You can start getting processes that turn it into more inert forms. So it looks to me like the ocean, part of the reason it's more effective is because you can think of the whole ocean in a way as the soil, as equivalent functionally as the soil on the surface. Well, I think Hieronymus Bosch had it right. The wheels of life go round and round, and I'm not going to say he was painting the carbon cycle or nitrogen cycle, but it's kind of it's something good to have in mind. Okay, evolutionary innovations now. What happens when evolution creates changes in the way organisms operate in some of these guilds? So I'm going to give you just a few examples that I've worked on, but I mostly want to talk about what I think it means for understanding the working of the biosphere over billions of years. First one, dimethyl sulfide. Atmospheric scientists did this. Dimethyl sulfides, this I should have said produces, not produced. It comes from a sulfur compound in organisms that's used for an osmoregulatory function within their cells, but it can get into the water and get oxidized in the atmosphere and become cloud condensation nuclei, and people have shown that it's probably a factor in keeping the Earth cooler than it would be otherwise without this a seeding of the clouds through a sulfur compound. but it was not produced to seed the clouds. It was produced to be an osmoregulatory agent within cells. Deep sea calcium carbonate deposition. This has to do with the fact that single cell creatures that evolved calcium carbonate shells came about only in about several hundred million years ago, and when they evolved, their shells can now go down deep into the ridges of the deep ocean and get into plate tectonics, go into the subduction zones, and come back up as CO2. Prior to that time, calcium carbonate was primarily or only deposited in shallow waters through creatures somewhat similar to coral and mollusks, and it seems to be well established that that shallow water deposition of calcium carbonate would be less subject to recycling because it's not really getting into the subduction zones. It can get into sediments that volcanoes can go through, but it would be a much smaller recycling flux. So the evolution of these planktonic calcifiers changed where the calcium carbonate was getting deposited. It changed the deep Earth's recyclability of that, and it makes climate warming. Then the biotic enhancement of weathering. This is work mostly done with my good colleague David Schwartzman, geochemist, looking at how life changes the chemical weathering rate of minerals on land. Not because it wants to change the weathering rate, it might want to have acids that release certain elements. The presence of soil, just the fact of having soil, creates moisture that's held for a long period of time around minerals that have large surface area, and that creates more of a chemical weathering flux, which is the removal of elements from a mineral form into a dissolved ion form. It can go into the water, it can go into the ocean. That produces climate cooling because the calcium that gets carried to the ocean will get deposited as calcium carbonate, which carries carbon out of the system. One can do models of these processes and ask how much cooling, how much warming. I just want to point out to you right now that there can be biological innovations that did not exist at one point in time, that then start existing at some point in time, that can create cooling or warming through effects on the carbon cycle. Okay, so that's just the point right now. Therefore, one wants to talk about what are these effects. Are they byproducts, or are they something like large-scale adaptations? And this gets into what are the dynamics of this system with the four components, the biochemical guilds, evolution working on them, the complementary metabolisms, and border fluxes up and down. Now, there have been several attempts to look at something stronger than what I'm going to tell you that I support, which is the byproducts viewpoint. One is the principle of maximum entropy production. It's been done by particularly Axel Kleiden in Germany. I've been publishing some papers on this, so has Kleiden. Vlada knows Axel Kleiden. And the idea here is that one could say that these processes are going to tend to a direction of large releases of entropy. Okay, and it's actually a big debate, and there's a debate about whether, because there's been some successes with it, but some controversy. But I've been critiquing this, and I don't think it's going to be very applicable to the biosphere. Now, ever since Schrödinger, we know that that organisms, and Schrödinger had neg entropy, I guess, right? We know that organisms cannot live unless they are net entropy producers. That's not controversial. The controversy is whether they are going to evolve into whether that's going to be a selective force on their evolution. So here's my simple thought experiment. You take a tree, and a tree is now going to put out, a mutant tree is going to put out a big black carpet. Okay. That's not doing photosynthesis, but it's going to absorb a lot of sun, and turn this high-quality shortwave solar radiation into just simple infrared or just simple convection that heats the planet up. It's a very high entropy, but it's not doing the plant any good. So which plant is going to do better? Which one's going to do better? It's the non-mutant's going to do better. So this, to me, shows that entropy itself cannot be the adaptation that's being selected for, because this tree would be dead. And one can find other examples. The DMS production I talked about earlier increases the global albedo, the reflectivity, which lowers the Earth's radiative entropy production. Light-colored lichen on a dark rock, it absorbs less of the high-quality sunlight than the dark rock does. It's not as high in entropy production as it could. The lichen has to produce entropy to live, but it's not necessarily producing more entropy than the abiotic world would be. And processes that increase CO2 and global temperature can be shown in some of these analyses also are counterexamples to maximum entropy. So what I conclude is that the explanations for physics and chemistry may be different from the explanations once you get into biology and culture because of invoking evolution. Gaia theory, called the book Gaia's Body, and I've been involved in many of the meetings with others and Jim Lovelock with Gaia. I think they often make a huge mistake, and I don't want to lump everybody together, and I also do want to say I did find Jim Lovelock brilliant at generating ideas about and asking the question, how does life impact the planet? So it was very influential on me. But that said, there are quotes such as calling Gaia an evolving system, and sees a system as having a goal, the regulation of surface conditions to always be favorable as possible for contemporary life. Because there seems to be this great fit between the oxygen we need and the oxygen in the atmosphere, and the CO2 that's, we're not in a permanent ice age right now, but we're not boiling the oceans, and this kind of fit between habitability has been kind of enigmatic. So I see that there's a problem in both, that there's sometimes similar problems about organisms that improve the environment will better propagate, sounds very good, or organisms that create more entropy will tend to propagate, but one can show that these cannot really be selected for. If the organism does something to change the atmosphere, then other creatures, well, excuse me, I got to make that much more explicit. The organism does something, releases a gas, let's say, that improves its condition in the sense that the gas goes out because it's improving the environment around it. What happens is that another organism just like it can get the benefit of that cloud, of that oxygen level, of that CO2 level, of the nitrogen, without doing the work, without doing the metabolic work of having produced something. So that, the strong idea of regulation through chemical, kind of evolved chemical outputs gets into the problem, the classic problem in evolutionary biology of cheats, of cheater creatures that don't pay the energetic cost but get the benefit. And that's all because of the free circulation of the biosphere system, and that chemicals are going to circulate elsewhere and other organisms can use it too. Which is why the CO2 you put out that is beautiful for a plant to use, you're not putting it out for plants to use. You're putting it out because it's a toxic waste in your body. But plants anywhere in the world use your CO2. And I showed you that they do, that basically every plant in the world is going to use part of your exhalation during the next year as that CO2 spreads around. That's how I think the biosphere works. It works by wastes that are byproducts. Because the waste, yes, you have to contract your lungs to expel the waste, but you have to do that to get rid of the waste for your life, not because you're improving the environmental matrix around you of the atmosphere. So we have this interesting situation in which there's there's this wonderfully marvelous system of integrated components that are highly productive, that have fluid circulations for free, that operate by biological evolution, that have created these complementary metabolisms because the wastes serve as a possible substrate that something can evolve to use. And that's how I think the biosphere works. And I'm going to, and I have a couple minutes, I want to say a few words about effects of these byproducts, and I want to focus a little bit on the biotic enhancement of weathering, which Vlada said you're interested in, and I've been interested in for a long time. So I'm going to show you that it may be a really dominant byproduct. David Schwartzman's been keeping me up to date on how much this biotic enhancement of weathering is, and he thinks it's 10 to 100 times. What that means is that for a given square meter of land with a given temperature and CO2 level, with life, there could be 10 to 100 times more weathering rate than there would be without life on that piece of land. And so when we model this, I'm going to show you a dramatic, but Schwartzman thinks it could be as high as the 100. This is a model over 4 billion years of Earth history, starting at a hot early Earth temperature in which life originates. If you just run the increase in sun of 30%, which we know pretty well that our star is increasing its luminosity over time because the nuclear fusion reactions increase over time, the Earth warms up. If you bring in the decline in volcanism, which lessens the amount of CO2 released, and the growth of the continents, these are all parameters you have to explore, and other people are going to give better numbers for these. The more continents you have, the more surface area you have to do the weathering. The removal of CO2, so that's a abiotic process. You do get a planet that cools, but now when you bring in the biological enhancement of weathering, and this one is using a simulation based upon microbial crusts, then the evolution of eukaryotes and the evolution of trees, you get today's temperature. Of course, I tuned it because I put the original temperature, but I'm demonstrating here that this biological effect on what's called the carbonate silicate cycle, this grand geological cycle of carbon, can be a factor that is larger than purely the physical, large-scale geological effects, and this would be inadvertent. Organisms, there's reasons trees evolved to put up leaves into the sky and put down deep roots because they're in competition. That had an effect of increasing the biotic enhancement of weathering. They did not evolve to increase that biotic enhancement of weathering. They evolved to have deep roots and be large. The early microbial crust did not evolve to increase biotic enhancement of weathering. They were evolved as bodies of algae and microbes that make these cryptogamic soils that lived in these consortia, not to increase the biotic enhancement of weathering, and yet the byproduct of this is a dramatic impact on the Earth. So this, I think, is the summary of the way the biosphere works. I do think that there's a lot of research here to do. One could look at trends. One could think about increasing the number of gills over time, increasing the degree of cycling over time, and there's probably increased photosynthesis over time as the number of gills and the cycling increase over time, given that any waste is potentially usable. The organism that needs that may not be there at the moment, but it could evolve to do it because it's a material resource that's out there circulating in the soil or the atmosphere of the ocean. So I think that there's quite a bit of research to be done on some of these topics were one interested to do so. So I think, Vlada, thank you. I'll end there.
Tyler. sure there's a lot of questions. Let's start.
I was intrigued by your use of the word guild. So, like, in my mind, that suggests kind of protectionism. So people, a guild protects its members.
Ah.
Are you suggesting that the biological guilds serve some function?
No, I wasn't going that far. I was thinking, medieval craft guilds, the goldsmiths or brick makers or something, but I wasn't thinking the protectionist mechanisms.
So why not use a more free market metaphor then?
What would be the term?
An industry, maybe, or something.
Okay, biochemical industries. Okay, take it under consideration. Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is, there are two time scales for evolution. Okay, this is my guess. One is that related to the information stored in the gene pool.
Yes.
Which has the largest time scale. But the other one is the epigenetic level, at which maybe organisms can adapt to the environmental conditions,
Right.
and change
Right.
in very short scales,
Right.
and try to change, or maybe adapt to the conditions
Mm.
that are available in the environment. So I want to ask you what is the effect of this. And the other question is, what is the effect of culture in all these interactions? I mean, culture or intelligence.
Yeah.
And on the interaction between the biosphere and all the components of the system.
Okay, so the epigenetic effect. So there are creatures in some of the guilds that can switch guilds, where they can go from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. Some can switch from being nitrogen fixers to taking up inorganic ions from the water. So there is plasticity in some of them, particularly in the bacteria. The second question, culture. So we are a metabolism. We are a metabolic impactor. Our CO2 is a byproduct, right, of our industrial energy processes. We're not putting the CO2 up there to warm the planet. So it's a great example of sort of the same thing. But I do think we have consciousness. I do think we can understand these. We are the guild that can know itself as a guild, maybe, and so therefore we can. We're talking about shutting down or slowing down our emissions of CO2. So that's because we're predicting the future, and so we are doing something that we are new on the scene. We in a way we are old, in that we're just expelling our wastes into the system, and all the other creatures have to adapt, because that's what's happened in the past. The creatures have to adapt to the new conditions as a new kind of guild comes online, but our culture can include the effects of us as a guild in culture itself, and therefore make modifications in our metabolism. If you want to say more, you can. Okay, thanks for the question.
More questions in the room? Okay.
The cycling ratio is really interesting. So is there a sense that large is better than small?
Well, okay, that's a really interesting question. Is large better than small? Because all the elements are needed. So all those like 12 to 16 elements are needed. So they all have to be processed by life. I guess I see not better, but I mean large in that large is better in that it's good to have something large, because if the large is the one that's more on the edge, having it be smaller means that would be controlling and reduce the total productivity. So in that way, large is essential, not essential. In that way, large is better. In other words, if the largest were just 2, then and that were with respect to carbon, then life is 1/50th of what it is. So if it's 2, life would be 1/100th of what it is today. So yeah, so large is good.
So for the purposes of discussion,
Yes.
if we're infinite, then there would be no variable. And if
Correct.
Cardinal barrier of O2 levels would be. So it's
Right.
It's an interesting question.
So-
Maybe there's an optimum somewhere.
Right, so I didn't do it, right. Of course, you're going to have other elements that are going to serve as a sink for O2 rather than the organic parts of it. Because, so, even though iron's necessary, I think, yeah, so large is good, be large. So some of the ones that are small, because of stoichiometry, because of small needs and large abundances, I guess would have to serve as the sinks for some of those. Great question, though. Kind of carry that out like a what if. It's a really great question. That would be like a great modeling question.
Has anybody, when talking about plasticity, has anybody looked at modeling of what happens after these major extinction events?
Yeah, it looks like my colleague Mike Rampino's been doing some of this. It looks like the ocean gets well mixed. It looks like the productivity goes way down. So they're looking at the carbon isotopes, and it looks like the ocean is. You don't get the separation that you now see, that you can even see in the planktonic versus benthic creatures. So it looks like productivity went way down, and surprisingly, and not well understood, it takes quite a while. It doesn't just snap back as soon as there's a few. Well, there are obviously a few species that make it, but even if they were to have free reign and proliferate, that doesn't seem to be enough. So I don't know if anybody's really looked at the evolution of some of these gills. Our modern coral, things that were kind of like coral, rudis went out at one of these mass extinctions, and coral came in. But in terms of the impact on the cycling, it does look like the system gets so perturbed that it maintains hostile conditions for a while. That's a really good question as well. Definitely an interesting question. Mm-hmm.
Nick?
Coming back to the cycling ratio, just a thought, we go back to Redfield's classic idea of the connection within the cycle. The kind of idea is that the phosphorus cycle is moving slowly, so it's got, I don't know which way this works in terms of the cycling ratio, but then the nitrogen cycle is and it's probably got a bigger cycling ratio, but it's kind of feeding back just enough so that the organism has sufficient nitrogen to use all the phosphorus.
Yeah, there's there's a way for the organisms to bring nitrogen into bioavailability through nitrogen fixation.
So are the flywheels kind of somehow regulating in order that it funnels elements into living molecules at in the right order?
Yeah. What he's bringing up is this really interesting fact that the global amounts of ionic nitrogen and ionic phosphorus in the world's ocean is about 15 or 16 to 1, which is basically exactly the same it is on average in the bodies of plankton in the ocean, about 15 or 16 to 1, something called the Redfield ratio. However, that's not true for iron, or it's not true for the other elements. But it looks like nitrogen has a special case, that there's really a way to bring the N2 in to the system in the way it's needed. And some of the elements other ones can be a little bit more loosely in play. But that nitrogen phosphorus ratio is so crucial to get that right.
So that would be more of a special case.
More of a special case. It's a beautiful case if any of you get interested in but it's a bit of a special case, but still a beautiful case, because it's so global in its extent of this coupling between the stoichiometry of the organism and the stoichiometry of the inorganic ions in the ocean.
Yes?
I'm a little confused about how you're looking at guilt. Am I part of the guild of photosynthesis because I breathe out CO2?
No, you're part of the. So the guild is defined by the chemical transformations that you make on that element. So the chemical transformations you make on carbon is to take organic molecules of carbon and to convert them into mostly CO2, like 80% goes into CO2. You also get some in feces and urea, of course. Yeah.
So it's not the it's not the complementary relationship between organisms that excrete what another organism
Right,
eats.
right. It's the boundary here is what the transformation is that organism does. Its input to its output.
Back.
So, on the topic of guilds and in particular cereal metabolisms, it would be, really great if we had any way of knowing if there were guilds that existed in the past but no longer exist today. But unfortunately, I think we don't. But one thing we can think about is the space of all possible guilds.
Cool.
So there's, a finite number of chemical species on Earth's surface.
Mm.
Each of those has a range of concentrations at which it exists, some
Mhm.
maximum concentration and minimum dilution.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are a finite number of ways you can couple them to, produce enough energy to drive ATP synthase.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about Earth's just past biogeochemistry, maybe this space of possible guilds has changed size at different times. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on, that and the extent to which it's saturated by the existing.
Well, some of the work on the nitrogen cycle, they've tried to make what they think is a sequence based partly on what form of nitrogen would probably get used up as it's available inorganically easily, and then that would make a crisis of a sort that would bring another guild in. So they've made some guesses on the evolution of the nitrogen cycle. What you brought up about the elements, you do get these strange things like, is it manganese in nitrogen fixing enzymes? And you do get these interesting things where sometimes some of these elements are not just used in the way you were talking about as kind of in the energy cycle, but materially in enzymes in certain amounts. Now people like Hal Morowitz, they've talked about how phosphorus, maybe anywhere in the universe, phosphorus might be used as in the energy systems of metabolisms on other planets because there's something so special about phosphorus that when ATP get discovered, the inevitability of some of these metabolisms, I think, is an interesting question and not one that could just easily be dismissed. I mean, one could maybe think about certain properties of nitrogen or phosphorus, of why they became certain functions inside cells, and then there might be reasons that they're in proportions in these stoichiometries inside cells. So I think that's worth thinking about in more detail.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Is that first?
Stop there. Hi. I might have actually only one question. Have you looked how this recycling cycle relates to some kind of sophistication of the entities of the guilds? So basically, for given conditions of the system, the higher this cycle is, the ratio is, the more sophisticated the system is. So if you look, for example, at the oxygen ratio, it should be increased. It might be changing with time, depending on how complex and involved the system, the biota is.
Yeah, I would say that's a good question. Like if you take the respirers, and then you're in the ocean and you have, fish is a certain kind of respirer, and then there's microbes at different levels. There's microbes that are in the water, and then there's microbes that travel down with the detritus and chew it up, but then there's worms and other microbes in the substrate. So I would think that it would get more sophisticated as
For given conditions.
Yeah. Good. Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just not useful. It can be also there,
Yeah, sure.
That's
That's
good.
both ways.
Maybe practically, if you go back to the last slide, the one to show weathering, could you elaborate a bit more? I would be really curious about the green curve. Now, because you mentioned here, tenfold microbial crust. How do you really do that? What's in the model? How do these microbes impact the weathering, or how do eukaryotes impact the weathering or trees? What is the difference?
Right. So you set up equations for the weathering rate, and then the biotic enhancement of weathering is input given as a parameter given studies people have done that, let's say, Schwartzman and I look at making guesses what these are for microbial crust and versus trees. So they've done studies where they have a landscape without trees and a landscape with trees. I think there was some done in Hubbard Brook Forest, for example, trying to get at some of these numbers. So there's some uncertainty here, but these would be numbers input from field studies.
How about the microbial ones? I mean, because you start with the beginning of the earth.
Right. So microbial ones would be things like lichen on rock, or cryptic soils that are completely maybe just sand, or bare rock versus soils that have bare rock versus a covering of some kind.
But wouldn't the anoxic ones early on, when there was no oxygen, be very different from the ones we have now?
Yes, but so now what are the main impacts here? Some of the main impacts are the retention of water in contact with high surface area. Wouldn't that could possibly be fairly the same, because that's really a physical effect that probably wouldn't be too much impacted by the metabolism of the organism?
I think the thing is, like, I don't know how the diversity or biomass was different 3 billion years ago. It depends most likely also on that, how much life you have. And also time isn't it like
right.
More time, it proliferates more, so maybe early on it wasn't so widespread or
Right, so biomass less, this would be going into where we think there were some kind of life on land, that it would not have been just a land with rock or big sand pits, because that would be a land without life at all, probably bedrock, or then you'd get particles eroding into large basins that would be somewhat like sand. But here you could actually have a veneer. There's some controversy about this, of course, but they think it was possible.
Okay. One last question over here.
I had a question. Is there a closed-loop computer model that's sophisticated enough to draw the green line? And could you put perturbations into it, like nuclear winter? Or?
No, not this scale, because this scale is doing steady-state computations in which the CO2 level is reaching new states every 100,000 years or so. So we're inputting these as a series of a steady state in which now evolution has been working in time, but the idea being that is that the carbon cycle will reach steady state in that 100,000 year, 500,000 years time period, but we're talking about 5 million year jumps or something like that.
So just the last question, practical question for now. So if you think about climate change and increasing temperatures, how do you see now the world without life and now with life? What is going to be the difference?
Yeah, it's a big. Well, we're gonna decide, or life will decide for us. Yeah, I don't know. I'm very involved now in looking at a question about whether global prosperity is going to be possible. I mentioned that early on, and I'm just really curious about what it's going to take for the world, everybody in the world, to live a Western lifestyle. And most people say, no way, it's not going to happen. But if it's not going to happen, then what does that mean? Let's say ethically for the lifestyle we live. Like, it's one thing to say we live a certain lifestyle and the rest of the world can get there too. It's just going to take some time. But if the world that's poor cannot get there, then that's going to have certain implications. So I want to try to look at resource and some of these issues of availability from the earth, what we extract versus what we recycle, I think is going to have to come into play. And we're seeing it starting to come into play with some of these designs for future cities, or cities that are operating now, places like Denmark, Sweden. things going on in Germany, for example. So I think that's just kind of a question for our age that we're going to all see play out over the next decades. And I don't have an answer to that yet.
Let's thank Tyler right now.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you.